We turn now to the latest developments in the FBI's widening targeting of anti-war and Palestinian solidarity activists. In late September, FBI agents raided the homes of activists in Minneapolis and Chicago. They seized phones, computers, documents, and other personal belongings. Subpoenas to appear before a grand jury were served on 13 people, but later withdrawn when the activists asserted their right to remain silent. But earlier this month, subpoenas were reissued against 3 of those targeted in the raids. And just this week, a new subpoena was delivered to a Chicago-based activist and journalist involved in Palestinian solidarity work, at least a 23rd person subpoenaed since September.
All those subpoenaed have been involved with anti-war activism that's critical of U.S. foreign policy. Details on the grand jury case remain scarce, but the subpoenas cited federal law prohibiting, quote, providing material support or resources to designated foreign terrorist organizations. In June, the Supreme Court rejected a free speech challenge to the material support law from humanitarian aid groups that said some of its provisions put them at risk of being prosecuted for talking to terrorist groups about nonviolent activities. Maureen Claire Murphy is the Chicago journalist and Palestinian solidarity activist who was issued a subpoena this week. Maureen is also an editor at the website Electronic Intifada, though the site is not being targeted in the FBI probe. In a statement, the Electronic Intifada said, quote, although the Electronic Intifada itself has not been a target of any subpoenas, we consider the grand jury investigation and all of the subpoenas to be part of a broad attack on the anti-war and Palestine solidarity movements and a threat to all of our rights. We're also joined from Minneapolis by Tracy Malm. Her home was among those raided by FBI agents in September. Some of her belongings were seized. She's one of 3 activists whose subpoenas were reactivated earlier this month. And we'll be speaking with 2 former FBI agents. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Mike German, National Security Policy Counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union, an FBI agent specializing in domestic counterterrorism from 1988 to 2004. And on the line from Iowa City, Colleen Rowley. She worked as an FBI special agent for almost 24 years. In 2002, she was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year after she blew the whistle on pre-9/11 intelligence failures. Let's go first, though, to Chicago, to Maureen Claire Murphy, who's just been issued the subpoena. Maureen, tell us what you know and what happened. How were you issued the subpoena?
So I was in my home office on Tuesday morning when I got the knock on the door that more than 20 activists around the country have now gotten from the FBI. And so they rang my buzzer, and when I answered, they identified themselves as the FBI, and they asked me if I would come and speak with them. And when I declined, they said they had a subpoena for me to appear before a grand jury here in Chicago on January 25th.
What else does the subpoena say?
As you mentioned, my subpoena is I'm one of 23 who have now been subpoenaed, and the FBI also served subpoenas to 3 other activists in Chicago on Tuesday throughout the city.
And did they attempt to seize any of your possessions or records or computers?
No, they did not come into my home, and none of the activists who have been subpoenaed since the September 24th raids, as far as I know, have had their property seized or their houses raided. So, you know, I don't think that they really need to come into my home and find out what I do, because I've always been working within the mass movement, you know, calling for the U.S. government to end U.S. aid to Israel. And, you know, it's kind of ironic that we are being subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury when oftentimes we're protesting outside of federal buildings, and we're calling on our legislators, and we're being very vocal and public in our calls for a more just U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. So I don't think the government needs to subpoena us to find out what we believe and what we do. And so that's why we think this is really about intimidating our movement and trying to silence our movement, because you know, they know what we do, and we know what we do is just and peaceful, and what it's really about is basically trying to silence our very strong and successful movement.
We want to turn right now to go back to two activists who we spoke to earlier this year. And as we cover this widening net that is ensnaring a number of people, we wanted to remind you of who these people are. Their homes were raided. They told their stories on Democracy Now! We spoke to Joe Yosbecker in Chicago and Jess Sundin in Minneapolis.
Friday morning, I woke to a bang at the door, and by the time I was downstairs, there were 6 or 7 federal agents already in my home, where my partner and my 6-year-old daughter had already been awake. We were given the search warrant, and they went through the entire house. They spent probably about 4 hours going through all of our personal belongings, every book, paper, our clothes, and filled several boxes and crates with our computers, our phones, my passport. And when they were done, as I said, they had many crates full of my personal belongings with which they left my house.
It was a nationally coordinated assault on all of these homes. 7 a.m., the pound on the door. I was getting ready for work, came down the stairs, and there were, I think, in the area of 10 agents. They identified themselves as FBI, showed me the search warrant, and I turned to my wife and said, "Stephanie, it's the thought police."
That's Joe Yosbecker and Jesse Sundin, Jesse in Minneapolis. Like them, Tracy Mulm's home was raided by FBI agents in September. Some of her belongings seized, one of 3 activists whose subpoenas now have been reactivated. Tell us what has happened now, Tracy.
Right now, our individual lawyers are being called into meetings with the District Attorney Fox in Chicago. They're essentially trying to scare us into talking, to naming names and giving them a case against the movement and against the people that we have worked with historically to fight for justice for the people of Palestine and the people of Colombia.
Well, we're also joined on the phone by Colleen Rowley, former FBI agent who was named by Time Magazine Woman of the Year for her exposure of the problems in intelligence by the FBI pre-9/11. Your reaction to these raids, especially since they all seem to be focused around people who were involved in Palestinian solidarity work, and there's certainly no indication that there's any terrorist threat to the United States here from the Palestinian movement.
Well, you know, after 9/11, there was a green light put on, and there was a very big blurring between protest, civil disobedience, and terrorism. And you saw this in many ways. The door was open to basically targeting, without any level of factual justification, advocacy groups. And again, this began pretty quickly after 9/11. It's gotten to the point now, 9 years later, and I wanted to mention the Washington Post is doing a pretty good job of exposing this in this top secret America, this monitoring. Their most recent article in the Washington Post is the FBI has 164,000 suspicious activity reports. Again, these are things that just have no level of factual justification that people call in, and the FBI is now keeping records on people. So I think that, you know, this case will just be the start of targeting various groups like this.
I wanted to turn to a clip of an interview we did recently when Bruce Nestor came into town, the former head of the National Lawyers Guild in Minneapolis. He's representing those who've been summoned before the grand jury. Bruce Nestor talked about potential consequences the activists face for defying subpoenas.
3 people are now looking at reappearing in front of the grand jury and likely being forced with the choice between talking about who they meet with, what the political beliefs of their friends and allies are, or perhaps risking contempt and sitting in jail for 18 months. These are people who are deeply rooted in the progressive community in Chicago and Minneapolis. Their grandmothers or mothers, they're union activists. They were some of the organizers of the largest anti-war march at the 2008 Republican National Convention. And they're being prosecuted under this material support for terrorism law, a law that was really enhanced under the Patriot Act, and that allows, in the government's own words, for people to be prosecuted for their speech if they coordinate it with a designated foreign terrorist organization. What you run the risk of there is that even if you state your own independent views about U.S. foreign policy, but those views somehow reflect a group that the U.S. has designated as a terrorist organization, you can be accused of coordinating your views and face, if not prosecution, at least investigation, search warrants, being summoned to a grand jury to talk about who your political allies and who your political friends are.
That was Bruce Nesters representing some of those being subpoenaed, former head of the National Lawyers Guild in the Twin Cities.